Hey y'all, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Longshot, the miniseries. I've actually covered this book previously, but I wanted to come back to it because at the time that I originally reviewed Longshot, I was doing so by treating it as an individual story, and which originally that's how the Longshot miniseries was supposed to be treated as its own story. But shortly after the miniseries came out in 1985, Longshot would become a member of the X-Men. And so, since I'm covering the essential X-Men books for the comic book reviews I've been doing lately, before I got into Volume 7 of the Essential X-Men series, I wanted to come back to the Longshot miniseries because Volume 7 contains the stories wherein Longshot is introduced to the X-Men and becomes a member of the X-Men. And the miniseries, the original Longshot miniseries, unfortunately, isn't collected in any of the Essential X-Men books. And so I wanted to, come and do a quick touch up on, the miniseries here, so that way when I did get to Volume 7, I hopefully wouldn't have to do too much of a recap on the miniseries. But also, another thing was that a couple of people have made the observation that if I'm going to be reviewing comic books, it would probably help for the purposes of entertainment if I showed y'all some of the artwork of whatever comic book I'm reviewing. And so you'll probably notice that I've gotten some makeshift bookmarks here, so that way when I finished my review here, I can go ahead and show y'all some of the artwork. But the miniseries, which was originally put out in 1985 and ran for 6 issues, was written by Nocenti and illustrated by Arthur, aka Art Adams. And Nocenti was working as an editor at Marvel at the time, but this was her first real writing role in a comic book. And this was Arthur Adams' breakout work, that basically got him in the door as an artist at Marvel. And so as the story was originally intended, it was meant to be, an introduction to the character of Longshot, and following the miniseries, he was supposed to have his own book, but for various reasons, it didn't really work out like that, and he instead ended up being snapped up to be a member of the X-Men. And so, while there are certain elements from the Longshot miniseries that carry over into the X-Men, the stories that were intended to follow this miniseries never really came to fruition. Although there are elements from the story ideas that made it into other books or other works by Nocenti. I mean, for example, in the stories that were originally intended to follow the miniseries, Nocenti had wanted to have the character of Mephisto be one of the main villains, but since that idea fell through, she took the notion of Mephisto being a primary antagonist, went and ran with it when she got the gig to be the regular writer for the series Daredevil. And so, I mean, her run on that book was a rather memorable one because, I mean, amongst other things, she introduced the character of Typhoid Mary, to audiences. And so, and also Mephisto would become a prominent antagonist, in the Daredevil series at that point. So there you go. But I think that this is actually a good mini series. I think it's a good story. It's a bit rough around the edges in the sense that you could tell that this was probably Nocenti's first time writing something, and it's also Arthur Adams' first time illustrating something, as far as like say a solid illustrating, gig that consists of something more than pinup art. But I think that both individuals, acquitted themselves well, and there's good inker and a good colorist working with them, and so as a result, I mean, while it is rough around the edges, I mean, it's a fun story, and it's really cool to look at, and there are some nice moments of satire, that Nocenti manages to weave into things. And even though I think Chris Claremont is definitely the better writer, I think that Nocenti had a better handle on writing the character of Longshot, because while Longshot is an important member of the team in certain stories of the X-Men, and he's definitely someone that people remember as a member of the X-Men. There came a point where it seemed like Chris Claremont just didn't really have much to do with the character anymore, and so the way he was written out, the X-Men book, was very anticlimactic, at least in my opinion. And I just think that, I mean, even though Chris Claremont was definitely the better writer in comparison to Nocenti, she did better at writing the character of Longshot, probably because it's her baby. But thankfully, though, it doesn't seem like there was any sort of bad blood between the two or anything like that. It's just that's how things work out sometimes in the industry. But I mean, they've worked together on multiple occasions, as in Chris Claremont and Nocenti, because she was an editor at Marvel, and Chris Claremont was a writer of one of Marvel's best-selling books, and Nocenti was one of the editors of that particular book. So, yeah, it's just one of those things where, had things been different, I think that Longshot would have been better incorporated into the X-Men series. I mean, beyond the point where it started to feel like, that the creative team didn't really know what to do with him, that kind of thing. But what could have been, right? But let's go ahead and get into the actual story. So, as Longshot opens up, it opens with this guy who's on the run from unknown forces, and he's in what appears to be another dimension. The environment's all red and violet, and the lighting's all weird, and so is the flora and fauna. But this portal opens up, and he doesn't know where it's going to go to, but he knows that it's probably the best chance he's going to get to escape from the people pursuing him. And so he goes through the portal and ends up in our world, but unfortunately he's followed by some of the people that were hunting him, and these people are actually monsters. But this individual, though, comes to be known as Longshot, because one of the things that he has, one of the things that makes him unique is, aside from the fact that he has amnesia, is the fact that he has three fingers, and three fingers instead of four. He also has thumbs, right? But he's got three fingers on each hand. But he also has this sort of luck power, in the sense that anytime he's trying to help someone, things just seem to fall into place. Or if he's trying to do something that's morally good, everything just works out in his favor. And so basically he has this luck power, and anytime it works, or anytime it kicks into gear, his left eye starts glowing. And so another ability he finds that he has is this ability called Psychometry, where he's able to basically read an object's history just by touching it. And so basically by touching something, he can see who's interacted with it, or he can see what's gone on around it, or see who was in possession of it at one point. And he actually uses this ability to help solve some crimes here and there. But unfortunately, though, because of his naive nature, um, there are several instances of cultural misunderstandings, between him and those he meets. And he's not, in any way a malevolent individual, but there are some instances where he does something that accidentally does harm to someone else. And case in point, there's an instance where um, he tries to steal these diamonds that are being held by this one particular company that is wanting to use them for we're talking like millions of dollars worth of diamonds that are going to be used for this laser research. And because a lot of people are complaining about this corporation having you know all this luxury and everything, and basically all the taxpayers' money is going towards that research project, and instead of say going to something that will actually help the tax-paying public. Longshot gets it into his head to go on a little adventure and steal these diamonds and give them back to the people. But unfortunately, though, in the process, I mean, this little adventure happens to take place in a power plant, and along with the fact that he's still being hunted by hostile forces from his dimension, he accidentally causes a blackout, during the fight. And as a result, the city of New York, I mean, is, pays the price for it for a little bit. But whenever he tries to give the diamonds back to, people, or just, someone to, someone that he thinks, could use the help, no one wants the diamonds because, I mean, it's in the news that these diamonds were stolen, and, they're like, no, these diamonds are hot. And of course, him, being the naive amnesiac that he is, he's like, no, they're not. They're cool, because he's feeling them, and he's thinking that they mean literally hot, but he doesn't understand that hot means stolen, right? So with that happening, you have, people like Spider-Man and She-Hulk, going after him because they're thinking that he's just another upstart, rebellious supervillain trying to make a name for himself, by causing a blackout and stealing the diamonds and everything. And so whenever he has to go up against them, his luck power kind of kicks into gear, and they find themselves kind of falling all over themselves, trying to get him and not being able to. But then they kind of get the distinct impression that he's not a malevolent individual, just someone who is, kind of confused and ignorant of the ways of, well, our world, so to speak. And so sometimes, though, I mean, he has a couple of adventures where he falls in with some outcasts of society, or those who are less fortunate, and ends up helping them out, and his abilities come into play and work out to where lives are saved. And when stuff like that happens, sometimes the people that are accompanying him benefit from their time with him, because he's like an eternally optimistic individual, and regardless of how dark or how negative something is, he insists that there's hope, and it's something that's kind of catching. So anyone who's with him kind of comes away feeling optimistic about whatever's going on in their life, regardless of how bad it is. And so sometimes, though, there seems to be a side effect, though, in a sense that whenever he uses his luck power, someone else has a run of bad luck. And case in point, there's a guy named Theo that he sort of buddies up with where in one of his adventures. And Theo is someone who is an unhappily married man, and was in the process of trying to kill himself. Um, like his kids, and his wife were driving him crazy, and he was constantly struggling with paying the bills. And he was one of the people that actually turned Longshot on to the idea of um, stealing from this company that had millions of dollars worth of diamonds, because he was complaining about how people like him are struggling just to get by when this um, this multi-billion-dollar company can just casually brag about having diamonds to throw around for their experiments, and so but anyway, though, on this little adventure that Longshot and Theo share, Theo initially tries to follow Longshot's example about being optimistic, but the thing is, he keeps on getting hurt, and he keeps falling down, and at one point he accidentally knocks out a good portion of his teeth by tripping, whereas Longshot's luck is working out for him, but Theo's luck Theo's luck it's just working against him. And so, but in a roundabout way, I mean, even though Theo proves to be a living jinx, I mean, his time with Longshot sort of does encourage him to, just suck it up and, go back home and try and, patch things up with his family, and because he's like, okay, life sucks, but it's not that bad, that kind of thing. But most importantly, though, Longshot comes across a woman named Ricochet Rita, who is a renowned stuntwoman for the movie industry. And Longshot, as it happens, ends up meeting her when he and a friend of his, this creature named Pup, who followed him from whatever dimension he came from. He and Pup were trying to catch a lift, and they followed this train, not knowing that the train was a part of a movie set. And so, with Longshot and Pup being on the train, apparently it ruined the shot. And so Ricochet Rita is, ordered by the director to, go in on her motorcycle and, get Longshot off the train. And so, she, thinking that Longshot's, some random bloke who's, trying to, steal the movie's thunder, challenges him to, get on her bike and, follow and keep up, the rebellious spirit, that spunk. And so he's actually able to kind of balance on the bike while she's riding, and the two of them make it, back to the movie crew. And the director was like, at first, he's all wanted to kill Longshot, but when he sees, just how good he was at physical performance, he's like, how would you like to be a new stunt man, and blah, blah, blah. And so, he basically, has Ricochet Rita, be his minder, and also, the one to show him the ropes. And so, Ricochet Rita and Longshot, actually become very good friends. And it kind of gets to a point where there starts to be some romantic stuff, between them. But unfortunately, though, it's around that time when, things start to fall apart, because Longshot, while he is amnesiac, he has been getting flashes of memory from his life before. And, the reason he's been called Longshot was because, the fact that the string of luck they has, I mean, it's basically a series of long shots, and so that's why he gets the name. But he starts to remember, though, that in the dimension that he came from before he came to this one, he was in a series of gladiatorial events, and it was all concentrated on television and the media. And he was constantly having to fight for the entertainment of these basically living couch potatoes called the Spineless Ones. But unfortunately, when he tried to lead a rebellion, it failed horribly, and he not only was his rebellion put down, but he was recaptured, and his mind was wiped. And so it's like all this stuff starts to kind of come back to him. Um, but in this one particular occasion, though, I mean, it nearly kills him because he remembers um, some of the events that happened, right when he's doing a dangerous stunt, for example. So he and Ricochet Rita unfortunately are separated, because everyone thinks he's dead because of a stunt gone wrong, and the director, instead of taking him to a hospital, just dumped his body in the swamp, and which is how he ends up meeting Theo, because Theo, when he was trying to commit suicide, accidentally stumbles on Longshot's body, but Longshot, is gradually healing up when he finds him. So, anyway, but because of that, though, Ricochet Rita and Longshot are separated, and she's thinking that Longshot, was either hurt or killed, during this, stunt gone wrong, and so, while Longshot is basically trying to make his own way after being separated from Ricochet Rita, his friend Pup comes to him here and there, but Pup starts to grow bigger, and whereas he was kind of friendly with Longshot before, he starts to become more malevolent and more spiteful towards him. And then other people from Longshot's dimension start making themselves known. Like, there are still some monsters that were left over, that held grudges against him. And while a good portion of them were sent back to their dimension during the whole diamond heist adventure, some of them, like Pup, were left behind. And one of them, it turns out, is a monster named Quark, who looks like a humanoid ram, but it turns out that Quark was actually an ally of Longshot. And of course Longshot doesn't remember him because of amnesia, but Quark is the one who kind of helps to catch him up on what happened prior to his mind being wiped. And so from there, we find out more about this dimension. It's called the Mojoverse, because it's ruled by this guy named Mojo, who rules the Spineless Ones. And basically he's like the TV producer from hell up to 11, but the whole world runs according to his whims. And so there are two races. I mean, there's the Spineless Ones, and then there's the slaves. And the slaves are basically anyone who is an upright humanoid, someone with a spine. And the Spineless Ones, basically they were terrified of people with spines. And so they had this geneticist of theirs, this violet color, or it's pinkish colored looking guy named Arise, create a slave race for the Spineless Ones, because they wanted a slave race that would do their bidding, but it'd be a slave race that they would feel good about mistreating or condemning or laughing at. And so when Arise created the slave race in the image of what they feared, namely an upright humanoid race of people with spines, that's where the whole slave race came in, and they served to be the source of entertainment for the Spineless Ones, and these gladiatorial contests that were constantly televised. And so people would be fighting to the death, and the Spineless Ones would eat it up as entertainment. And so Longshot, though, it turns out, was actually created by Arise, to be the leader of a rebellion for the slaves against the Spineless Ones. And so, the reason that he has the psychometry and the luck power is because Arise actually, built that into him when he created him. Because all the other slaves, they didn't have Longshot's powers, but Longshot was unique among them in the sense that he's the only one who had the luck power and the psychometry. And so basically, he was meant to be a leader, for the rebellion of the slave race against the Spineless Ones, but unfortunately, it didn't work out. And what ended up happening was after his mind was wiped, he was able to escape, but he still had no memory of who he was supposed to be. And, when he did meet Arise, again, I mean, some of his memory was returned to him. But once again, I mean, when he came across Mojo's forces, they, captured him and mind wiped him again. But then he escaped again, which is how he ended up being on the run originally, and then showing up in our dimension. So basically, Quark's the one who fills Longshot in a lot of the stuff that happened, and we get some, flashbacks filling the stuff in. But, we also find out that Ricochet Rita was captured, I mean, in a time that, Longshot was, doing his thing, after everyone thought he was dead. Ricochet Rita was captured by Mojo and his lieutenant, Spiral, who's a six-armed woman who has the ability to basically dance in between dimensions, which, basically, through her dances, she creates, a gateway from one dimension to another. And she also is a powerful sorceress, too. And for some reason, she hates Longshot. And it's implied that the two of them may have had a relationship at one point or another, but of course Longshot doesn't remember her, and so he doesn't understand why she hates him and why she's constantly trying to kill him. And she develops a hatred for Ricochet Rita as well, because she sees that this is someone that Longshot loved, and she also has two arms. And so, Ricochet Rita, I mean, much like, the master that she serves, she hates, anyone who has two arms, anyone who's like a quote unquote normal humanoid, and so, she kind of goes along with Mojo's torture of her, that he subjects Ricochet Rita to, but, we do eventually, get to a point where Doctor Strange gets involved because, him being the master of the mystic arts, he's been detecting all these mystical incursions into our dimension, courtesy of, the monsters from the Mojoverse, trying to get into our dimension when they were going after Longshot. And so, Doctor Strange ends up, getting involved with Longshot and Quark, and in the process, rescuing Ricochet Rita, when she was left for dead by Mojo and Spiral, but her mind was just broken, because she was, subjected to the entirety of, the dimensional travel, like her eyes were, and her mind were exposed to far more than the human, consciousness was capable of withstanding, and so she was rendered catatonic. But when, Doctor Strange ends up, getting involved with Longshot and Quark, they're able to, help Ricochet Rita, gradually, come out of her catatonic state. But at that point, Longshot and Quark are having to work together to foil Mojo's, plans to, make, a religion on Earth that follows, Mojo. So while they're trying to foil Mojo's plans and fend off Spiral as well, Doctor Strange and his friend Wong are having to, try and help Ricochet Rita come out of her catatonic state. Unfortunately, they're successful in that regard. And Longshot and Quark are successful in defeating Mojo and ending his scheme to, create, a new religion in his name on Earth, which would be, made up of mind-controlled humans. And so, having survived that adventure, Longshot and Quark are, about to, head back into the Mojoverse, because now that, Longshot, knows who he is and what his purpose is, he realizes that, the fact that, he was in a dimension full of, people with spines, proves that, the Spineless Ones, aren't the, masters that they, want the slaves to think that they are. And Ricochet Rita, though, she, has fallen in love with Longshot, and, she and Longshot were already falling in love, prior to them being separated. But, after she's been, rescued and she's recuperated and everything, she begs Longshot to, take her with him because, she loves him. And, she says, besides, if you go back without proof, that you've been to, a dimension full of people with spines, everyone's going to think you're crazy, just like they thought you were crazy here. So, one, we'll be together, and two, I'll be proof that, you were indeed in a dimension full, in a world full of, people with spines. And so, Doctor Strange, opens up a portal for them, or he aids in, the three of them going through this portal, from our world into, the dimension where, Mojo world is. And that's how the story ends. But it ends on a hopeful note, though, because, Doctor Strange, he's pointing out that, Longshot is someone who initially had no memory or anything, but when he was given, the answers, to, his questions, he found a new sense of purpose. And when he realized that, his, luck power, was, and when he realized what the problem with his luck power was, in the sense that anytime he used his power, someone else had a string of bad luck, he realized that he had to try to be more constructive with his power. And so, as Doctor Strange is pointing out, with Longshot, learning these things and being determined to apply, what he's learned in his, new role as, a leader of rebellion, for, the slaves against the Spineless Ones. Doctor Strange feels like that as evil as, the Mojo verse is, Longshot is someone that can, be the spark for good in that dimension. So, yeah, that was actually a pretty, good miniseries, a good story. I'm going to go ahead and give Longshot the miniseries 4 out of 5 stars. I will say that, the first time I reviewed it, I think I gave it 5 stars. But having reread it, I'm gonna bring it down to 4, because the writing at times is rough around the edges, and I see what Nocenti was going for, in the sense that she's trying to give us a character who is naive and simplistic, but endearingly optimistic at the same time. And when she's writing for the character of Longshot, I think that that works out very well. But when she's writing other characters, though, they at times feel kind of simplistic in a way that doesn't work out so well. like you have characters who are older than Longshot and have, as far as we can tell, maybe more in the way of life experience than Longshot, but the way they're written, though, it's almost just as simplistic as Longshot's being written, except for the character of Longshot, though, it actually works. And so, while this approach, I mean, has some mixed effects when it comes to, say, characters other than Longshot, I did find that the style worked when it came to, say, for example, like a group of little kids that Longshot ends up befriending, that basically because their parents are constantly trying to you know pawn them off on other people. The kids, they sort of have formed this little group and just play on the streets and are in their own world, and Longshot ends up befriending them. But because they're kids, though, the simplistic mindset and the simple style or that Nocenti was writing in, for the kids, it actually works. So for like the characters like Longshot and the kids, that particular writing style works very well. And also when it comes to, say, whenever she's writing from the perspective of, say, Mojo or Spiral, in terms of Mojo, there's this really dark sense of satire of the media that I think works really well. And the way Mojo's designed, as illustrated by Arthur Adams, I mean, he's a very grotesque and terrifying looking character. But the way he's written, though, I mean, it's a very dark sense of satire that I feel like works rather well. And I mean, yes, I mean, the story is an 80s story, but a lot of the satire about the media industry in general, kind of carries over to where it's even relevant today. And also, for the character of Spiral, there was a sense of menace about her character to where, while a lot of the writing was very, I guess you could say, fun and energetic, for, say, a lot of the other characters and just for the narrative in general, when it came to Spiral, though, there was a sense of darkness with her character to where, she tends to be more intimidating than Mojo. And Mojo's the main villain, and don't get me wrong, he is very intimidating when you look past all the, goofball antics. But thing is, he's written as someone who's supposed to be a satire, of the media industry. Whereas Spiral, though, is written as someone who is, a very powerful individual, but also someone who is unhinged in her, hatred for Longshot. And so while she has controlled moments of anger, that anger is always there. And so as a result, I mean, she's someone who comes across as a serious threat. Whereas, say, the other threats that Longshot goes up against, I mean, they're dangerous, but there's a sense of fun, But when Spiral's, on the scene, though, and yeah, there is some witty, back and forth banter between her and Mojo, it things do tend to be more serious when she's on the scene. But I did like how, whenever Longshot, was consciously trying to help someone, even if he did so in a way that inadvertently resulted in, say, like a blackout or something like that, his heart was in the right place. And there are some genuinely moving moments when he does help someone. Like, for example, in the first issue, when he and this survivalist, team up to, help this woman whose baby was kidnapped. And it turns out, the baby was kidnapped by Spiral and the monsters that made it through, the portal that Longshot came through. And so when they were going after him, they made it through into our dimension too. But in order to get back to their dimension, though, they initially try a ritual involving human sacrifice, and that sacrifice was going to be this baby that they kidnapped. And so Longshot and this survivalist nut, end up teaming up to help this woman, and the three of them, are able to find, where Spiral and the monsters are conducting this ritual. And that's when Longshot is probably at his purest, in the sense of his luck power, because as unlikely as his chances of success are, everything works out in his favor, because he's focused on saving the babies, focused on saving the innocent. And when he does so, and when he brings the baby back to the mother, both the mother and the survivalist are just kind of moved to tears about it all, because here they are in a world that seems to be poised on the edge of Armageddon. We're talking Cold War stuff, right? Everyday stress, everyday troubles, economy's collapsing, things like that. And yet here's this guy who out of the kindness of his heart risks his life to save a complete stranger's baby. Then this is something that the authorities wouldn't do or even touch. And so both the survivalist nut who has become very cynical in his views of his fellow man, both him and the mother are given a sense of hope, with the fact that Longshot and his selflessness ultimately saved the day and saved the baby, and the baby now has a chance of life. And so seeing their reactions and people's reactions like that in the book, I thought were nice moments and very moving moments, and I thought did a lot in the way of going towards what Nocenti was originally trying to do with the series, or with the character, in the sense that she was writing the story at a time when there was a lot of uncertainty in the air. There's a lot of uncertainty in the air now, but we're talking like a lot of stuff that was going on in the 80s held a lot of people down. And so she was wanting to create a character that would represent that moment where everything for once would go right. Maybe it's like that ray of sunshine coming in through the window, or maybe it's a song you hear. It's that kind of feeling. She was wanting to capture that kind of feeling, but personify it with the character or embody it with the character of Longshot. And so I think that in moments like that, she and the creative team succeed, and she would get better as she went on in terms of writing. Outside of the Longshot miniseries, because the writing here, it's simplified, or it's simplistic in a lot of ways, but at the same time, because of the type of character we're dealing with, and a lot of the focus is on a simplistic character, or a simple childlike character, in a sense of his naivety and his innocence and the way that the world really works and everything. Her writing is simplistic, but it's something that it can be, forgiven if not overlooked. And because Longshot is such an endearing character, and he's the one that gets the majority of the focus, I think that as a result, while Longshot isn't, say, the best book I've ever read by any means, it is still a good book. It's flawed, but it is good though. And the artwork by Arthur Adams is just phenomenal. And, this is something that, you look at it and you can see where a lot of people like, Todd McFarlane and Rob Liefeld, got some inspiration from, and things like that. Even Jim Lee. And so, and considering it, this was, his first, real work, I thought that Arthur Adams did a good job of acquitting himself rather well. And in interviews, he's talked about how, he was, struggling, starting out, working on this book, but, but various people at Marvel, took the time to help him out, and, and he learned how to, do a better job of capturing proportion and what have you. And so there is still like a comic book aesthetic in the sense that people sort of look outlandish and everything, or, there's like a caricatured sense of proportion with some of them at times. But for the most part, though, I mean, he does a pretty good job of, you know, drawing, people in a series of fantastical events. And I thought that, for amongst other things, he did a wonderful job on the characters of, of course, Longshot, Spiral, Doctor Strange, and Ricochet Rita. I thought he did a good job whenever it came to drawing them. But also when it came to, say, like the character of Theo, the guy, the suicidal guy who was convinced that he himself was a jinx. I mean, when it came to drawing Theo, I mean, I thought Arthur Adams did a good job of, giving us a character that looked like, Joe Blow with a bad back and a bald head, and who was utterly miserable, and yet having him side by side with Longshot was probably one of the series' funniest moments, But I mean, I thought that, for a first time effort, they, both Nocenti and Arthur Adams, did a good job. And you could tell that they're both rough around the edges, but at the same time, there's a lot of talent that's clearly there. There's a lot of potential that's there. And it's more apparent in the case of Arthur Adams because of the visuals on hand. More so him than Nocenti, but at the same time, the writing and the story are original enough to where, even in Nocenti's case, you could tell that, she has a lot of, potential, to be a good writer, and she would fulfill that potential, in stuff after the Longshot series, namely, the Daredevil series when she took over as writer. But I will say that there was another area that I thought, while I did find the development of Pup, becoming a threat, to be interesting, I felt like, there were moments where it seemed like, Pup was, genuinely a friend of Longshot, but he maybe had his own agenda, but at the same time, he was, still a friend to him, a friend of his. But then they had it to where, he's just suddenly, becoming, spiteful and hateful towards Longshot. And it kind of coincides with him, getting bigger, because one of the things that you find out is happening is, because of Pup's nature and physical nature and like of his being from another dimension, it's, causing him to swell up with, a lot of the magical energies of this dimension. And so if left unchecked, Pup is going to basically, drain, our world of all its magic. And so, and when that happens, he basically becomes a complete, insane, monster who is dead set on killing Longshot and, anyone who's friends with him. And so when that happened, I felt like that development was a little sudden. I mean, I think that it might have worked better if it had been more gradual. Like maybe if we had it happen to where, the moments with Pup were less ambiguous, because there are moments where Pup helps Longshot and he has genuinely friendly banter with him. But then it's like we'll see the way he's thinking, and he's like, he's thinking, well, here's hoping you don't find out such and such, that kind of thing. I think that if maybe we had seen it to where, Pup was more conflicted, like on one hand, he does view Longshot as a friend, but he's also trying to get back to, where he came from, and, but at the same time, he doesn't want to stab his friend in the back to do so. And so it would have been interesting if, we'd gotten like that kind of conflict, plus the fact that being in our dimension is kind of driving him crazy because of all the magical energy he's absorbing. And they do touch on that, because as the miniseries goes on, we see the character of Pup become more monstrous physically, and as he becomes more monstrous, he becomes more bloodthirsty. And so the idea is there, but I just think that maybe the writing, this being Nocenti's first time as a writer, that idea wasn't, fully, set in stone. Like, it wasn't, voiced completely. I think that it was more implied than anything, or it was clarified by some characters, but it was done so in a way that comes across as very rushed. So, just maybe, with hindsight being 2020 and everything, if there had been a little more in the way of, say, experience on Anna Nocenti's side, I feel like that, she and the creative team could have had to where, Pup's transition from, ambiguous friend to, full-on enemy, would have been more gradual and more tragic, because we would have seen that, yeah, Pup has his own agenda for trying to get back home, but we could have seen something like, yeah, he's really starting to see Longshot as a friend and is trying to help him, and vice versa. But then at the same time, he's being driven insane by all the magic he's absorbing, and as a result, so a lot of the stuff that happens isn't entirely, his fault, because he can't control, what he's becoming, by being here. So I feel like, if something like that happened, I mean, it would have been a better, transformation for the character of Pup, and the outcome would have been a lot more tragic. I mean, it is there in the book as it was originally put out there, but I just think that maybe with a more skilled hand, the transition could have been better, or the transformation of the character could have been better, but yeah, overall though, I mean, I thought that it was a good story, and the artwork was wonderful to look at, and the writing was original enough to where you're like, okay, I mean, rough around the edges, but keep an eye on this kid, that kind of thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and give Longshot 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good story, and as promised, I'll show y'all some of the artwork. So first off, literally the first page of the first issue, and you got Longshot on the run, and you see the violet and red colors of the other dimension, the Mojoverse. But that was literally the first page of the first issue, and already it looks amazing. And I should also mention just real quick that Whilce Portacio, I hope I'm saying the guy's name right, was the inker, and Christie Scheele was the colorist. And so the colors are something that really stand out. But we also have, I like this pages because, I mean, we got Longshot, looking up in the night sky, contemplating, his identity or lack thereof. And you got some good lighting there, and this is when Pup's introduced, and he throws these knives thinking that Pup's an enemy, but then it's like, nope, you scared the poor guy. So yeah. But I really do like, how alien they made Pup look, like something that the Jim Henson crew would do. I think they do a good job at that. And this is the survivalist that he makes friends with in the first issue, and the two of them are the ones that help the mother get her baby back. I kind of like this guy. I mean, he is off his rocker, but at the same time he's got a good heart though, so. Oh yeah, okay, so this is the last page of the first issue right here, but this is after they've save the kid and everything. And after, Longshot says goodbye to him, he and Pup, go off to their next adventure. And here's part of the picture from, the cover of the second chapter. Always like that shot there, but you see, like, its eye glowing. And this is when, Pup and Longshot are trying to find a, ride, and they inadvertently end up, spoiling a shot for this movie. But you see this, train that he and Longshots get on. And this is where Ricochet Rita comes in, it's ordered by the director, by the movie's director. And there she is, getting Longshot off the train. And to the crew. And incidentally, Nocenti was actually, Ricochet Rita was actually modeled after Nocenti herself. And so, there you go. And I like this series of panels right here because, here you got, the stunt going horribly wrong, and the director, in his infinite wisdom, is using a series of live functioning lasers, which can hurt and kill. And so, Longshot ordinarily might have been able to weather the storm with no problem with his luck power, but unfortunately, at this point, he was going through some stuff in his head that was shaking, his confidence, and he wasn't able to really focus, and so he ends up, getting near mortally wounded. But he's also, being hit with these flashbacks, and at one point he's remembering, this group of people that are basically branding him, but it's in a sort of ritual to symbolize him becoming a leader of the rebellion. But then he snaps back to reality and ends up getting really badly hurt with the lasers. And here's the character of Theo, the living Jinx. And this is where I feel like, Arthur Adams was starting to, evolve within the series as an artist, because, you get the idea that, he was really trying to draw just, an ordinary, man and his family here in a rundown home. And here's another point I liked. It's another flashback that Longshot's having, but this is the first time you see the Spineless Ones, not Mojo yet, but the Spineless Ones themselves, and you see them sort of gloating and talking about their slaves, and there they are right there. And this is after, another attempt at rebellion in a flashback here. There's Longshot being tortured. There's one of the Spineless Ones wiping his mind. And this is the end of Longshot and Theo's adventure here. After they accidentally caused a blackout and stole the diamonds. But I like the contrast, with Longshot looking, pure and fashionably good, and then you got Theo here, looking all scraped up and muddy and everything, kind of adding to the notion of Longshot being perfect, and and Theo just being a broken down man. But I do like how I mean, as fed up as he's become with Longshot, I mean, his adventure has kind of encouraged him to try and go back to his family and fix things up, hence all the flowers he's picking. Okay, and so this is the group of kids that Longshot ends up befriending. And, sorry, yeah. So I really like this group of characters right here. And if I remember correctly, they actually, I think they show up in the Daredevil series when Nocenti was writing the book. And because I know I've seen him in something outside of Longshot, and I'm pretty sure it was Daredevil, you know, but yeah, like, you know, the way they look, I mean, they look like little kids and everything. And, you know, the way Nocenti writes them, I mean, they really sound like little kids too. And you even have, you know, the little girl in the group having a crush on Longshot. And this, if I remember correctly, is the first time we see Mojo. So first here, there he is with his assistant Major Domo. But right here though, you know, we see just how gruesomely terrifying he looks, I think. With all these, you know, things, you know, embedded in his eyes to keep his eyes open. And here he is kind of torturing himself with a sensory overload. But he's doing so, you know, of his own free will and glee. Okay. And here's Spiral. She's actually appeared, she's been in the book before this, but I thought this is actually a nice little shot of her, because you see her in her uniform and without her helmet. Then there, though, you know, you see her at work, you know, starting the dance, opening a doorway for her and Mojo to go through into another dimension. So the two of them silhouetted in the light there, Mojo and Spiral. Because sometimes, you know, she's able to dance in between dimensions, you know, herself, but to get from Mojoverse to our dimension and vice versa, it has to be with Mojo. And barring a, you know, sacrificial ritual, of course. And I like this, you know, series of, you know, panels here, because at this point, you know, the kids, you know, had the bright idea to, you know, grab a gun, you know, because, you know, they're, you know, trying to, you know, hunt down a monster, which turns out to be Pup. And Longshot, you know, he's, you know, grabbing the gun from them and, you know, getting its history. And on one hand, you know, he's getting the gun's history, but in the process, though, you know, this in turn is reminding him of the violent history that he had as a, you know, in the rebellion. And, you know, basically, you know, how it's like, you know, one weapon with a history can sort of, you know, trigger, you know, a reminder that, you know, he has a history that's fraught with tragedy and horror. And once again, a rebellion has failed, and his mind is wiped. And there's Spineless Ones, you know, cheering, you know, the demise of the rebellion. And there he is in the, you know, I guess a prison or in a mental ward or something. But it's interesting how, you know, the flashbacks are done, you know, in the sense that it goes from the present to the past and kind of melts back into the present, you know, the way it's illustrated. And I like this shot right here because, you know, you got the kids and Longshot, you know, looking in horror at what Pups become. You know, because remember that cute little guy that we saw earlier? Well, not cute anymore. And this is where we kind of realize just how far Pup's gone, because, you know, yeah, even though he was willing to help some of Longshot's friends earlier, you know, now we see that he's willing to kill, you know, his friends, namely these little kids. And so when he's, you know, trying to attack the kids, you know, Longshot realizes that, you know, his friend is off the deep end. And he's still fighting Pup, right? But this is where Quark comes in. We've seen him before, but, you know, he was, you know, portrayed as kind of an enemy. Like, he was working with the monsters that were going after Longshot. But here, you know, he's revealed to, you know, be a good guy. And I like that he also has that eye glow. And so, and Quark has an interesting ability where he's able to turn almost intangible. Like, he's able to turn into his, you know, smoke form almost, and, you know, whisk from one spot to another. So there's Quark and Longshot, you know, going after, you know, this now monstrous Pup, you know, and the kids are kind of cheering him on, and one of them gets a little enthusiastic about it. Okay. All right, and so here, you know, is Mojo and Spiral and their crew, you know, traveling in between dimensions after, you know, Spiral's done the dance. And there's Spiral, you know, lashing Ricochet Rita to the prow of the ship in an attempt to, you know, torture her into breaking and telling them what she knows about Longshot. And basically it's up to her, you know, if she, you know, if she talks, the torture ends. But, you know, she's determined not to break because, you know, she, you know, cares about Longshot and doesn't want to betray him. But in the process, her mind is broken because she's just exposed to, you know, more than, you know, one ordinary person was meant to see, in terms of, say, going in between dimensions. Like, it's one thing for Mojo and Spiral because they're built for that, or, you know, but Ricochet Rita's not. So, and I like this artwork right here because, you know, you're seeing him, you know, using a psychometry, and in the process it triggers another flashback, and he's still on the run, but this is where he gets into the territory of his creator, Arise. And you see, like, there's these sort of, you know, friendly creatures floating around. And so that's where I feel like the sci-fi and fantasy angle of the book really comes into swing in terms of the artwork. And this, you know, creature comes up to him and is asking him some questions, and they talk for a bit, and then, you know, the creature opens up, and out comes Arise. I love the detail on his face right there. And here, I mean, you got Arise, you know, talking about, you know, the history of, you know, his involvement with, you know, the Spineless Ones and how he created the slave race, but how he basically, you know, created Longshot to be the one to lead the rebellion. Like, he's the only one that he gave him the luck power to. And right here, I love, you know, this series of panels because it's kind of like, you know, we get a bit of horror here, or cosmic horror in a way, because, you know, Ricochet Rita, she's been left in her home. You know, she's been discarded by Mojo and Spiral, but she's just hollowed out and broken and left in this eerie, silent scream. And Longshot's helpless to do anything for her. And I feel like at this point, you know, towards the end, I mean, Arthur Adams was already, you know, doing a good job throughout the miniseries here, but towards the end, I think his artwork was really beginning to come into its own. And, you know, this series of panels with Longshot and Quark, and the detail and everything. Here we got another flashback of the Rise. Also, I mean, still in the last flashback of Arise that Longshot has, but I love the, you know, techno horse they rides off in, and then back to the present. There's a very good detailed look of Spiral's face. And here, Longshot and Quark, you know, fighting back against Mojo and destroying, you know, his new base of power. Very, very terrifying, monstrous smile that Mojo's got there. But I love that shot of Longshot on the hang glider, though. Last but not least, I love that shot right there. Longshot's, you know, luck power kicking in towards the end. And of course, you know, them going up against Spiral and Mojo. And here comes Dr. Strange to save the day with Ricochet Rita and her pet parrot, and thankfully she's alive and well at this point, or she's whole and hearty at this point. And that smile right there that Longshot has, that's a smile that Arthur Adams would use for a lot of his characters, and it's a smile that, you know, people like Todd McFarlane, Eric Larson, and Rob Liefeld would use. So it's definitely a lot of influence, something that influenced a lot of people right there. And last but not least, you know, the last page of the last issue. Beautiful artwork, though. And this is after Ricochet Rita and Longshot and Quark have gone back through to, you know, Mojo world, to the Mojo verse. And Dr. Strange is basically, you know, having the final thoughts of the book. And so here's the front cover. It's Longshot and Pup. And on the back, beautiful artwork here. Both the front and the back were illustrated by Arthur Adams, but you got Mojo looming on in the background, you know, terrifying as ever. Then you got Spiral, decidedly intense looking. Then you got Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, She-Hulk, Quark, and Ricochet Rita. So, yeah, that was Longshot, the miniseries. 4 out of 5 stars. So, you made it this far. Thank you very much. You got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So, y'all take care. Have a great night. Bye.